Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. I'm Ignacio Socias, Director of International Relations of IFFD. Just wanted to give you a very warm welcome from the distance, in my case from Brussels today. And just to confirm you that we are very interested in this focus group because new technologies have been identified by the UN as one of the mega trends for the preparations and celebration of the of the 30th anniversary of the International Year of the Family in 2024. Topics such as inequality, digital inclusion, digital governance have been already treated in an expert group meeting, and we hope we will be able to get into them with a project that will include, in these 3 years, regional expert group meetings, local race awareness events, UN events, as the one we have already organized for next month. Some of you know about it. Also, collaboration with municipalities and regions, and events organized in the different bodies of the European Union. I won't steal more time of this meeting now. Just let me thank you once more, all of you, for your participation. I can see that we have someone who's missing, but let's hope that she can come. And just also wanted to thank Stiftelse Meyenburg for funding this project. Also the civil society representatives and other stakeholders who will follow these meetings through YouTube, and particularly Remy Verlick, who's here, who will be the one to do all the hard work after it. So with this, I give the floor to Paul, and I sort of disappear from this meeting. See you later.
Thank you, Ignacio. Well, first of all, like Ignacio said already, I want to welcome also everybody to this online focus group. My name is Paul Graas, and I will be the moderator of the session. I'm research manager at Interaction Group, and that is a platform that develops educational material for parents and teachers to help children to navigate in the digital world. And I'm also a consultant at the IFFD, where I develop also educational material for several courses. So it's my honor to moderate this focus group today. And we all know the context, but I will say it once more, that the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs has decided that the topic for next year's Commission on Social Development will be socially just transitions towards sustainable development, the role of digital technologies on social development and well-being of all. And also the same topic will be also featured for the International Day of Families, observance of the UN on May the 15th. And in order to assist policymakers, IFFD, together with other global organizations of civil society, wants to contribute with the conducting of qualitative studies and with the creation of relevant publications on the subject. And above all, the impact of new technologies will be most probably featured as one of the suggested mega trends of the United Nations, and what Ignacio already told during the preparations and celebration of the 30th anniversary of the International Year of the Family in 2024. So focusing on this meeting, the online meeting will consist of the replies from each of you, experts, replies to each question, and will be expected to not exceed 2 minutes. And all of the participants are welcome to attend in observer capacity only through the link of YouTube. The transcription of the meeting will be used to produce a publication and include final recommendation based on the points participants will have raised. And the final outcome will contribute to adjust and enhance the recommendations of the Civil Society Declaration on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the International Year of the Family. So thank you again very much for your presence here today. Matt Brossard can be here for a last-minute duty, but fortunately he has been with us before recording the replies to the questionnaire. We also have two new experts, Susan Walker from the University of Minnesota and Jessica Navarro from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, who will undoubtedly enrich our discussion today also. So what I propose is I will read the question, and then in the first question round, I will say just I can mention your name, and then you have the 2 minutes to contribute to that question. Okay? So the first person I want to invite to talk is Tracy Burns. She's Senior Analyst for the Center for Educational Research and Innovation of OECD at the Directorate for Education and Skills in Paris, France. So Tracy, the floor is yours.
So answering the first question, correct? Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pardon, Tracy, I actually didn't read the first question. That was my fault. I will read it loud. It's, should the universal coverage of the internet be considered a human right?
Thank you. I was going to read it for anyone watching. I thought it would be useful for them to know. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's great to be here and to be able to discuss these important issues with colleagues from around the world. I mean, it's a great starting question because it's a provocative one and you can weigh in on either side. From my perspective, I mean, there are a number of countries which have already declared internet access as a human right. Costa Rica is the one that stands out as one of the first to really take that step and really identify it. But of course, with all the disruptions due to COVID, we saw more and more countries discussing this. And we also saw the impact of what happens if you don't have access to the internet and the fact that you become very easily excluded, not just from education and sort of schooling, which of course is our main concern in the Directorate of Education, but also from citizenship and democratic participation. So I think there are actually, not just philosophically, but legally, very good reasons to sort of reposition the internet as being part of the suite of human rights that we might expect adults and children, in fact, to have access to be able to realize their full potential and to take part in the world and grow as humans. I'd also include, of course, the entire discussion also around the freedom to be who you want to be and to love who you want to love and to really realize yourself and your well-being, you know, your full holistic well-being. And I do think that the skills, access, and ability to use the internet is really necessary for functional participation in an increasingly digitalized world.
Thank you, Tracy. I now want to invite Amina Fazlullah. She is Equity Policy Counsel of Common Sense Media in Washington, D.C. So Amina, could you can you share your contribution about this question?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I wanted to just add from the perspective of children and families, because Common Sense is most focused on children and families, that much to echo what my colleague just said, you know, for kids and families to fully participate in society, they need to have access to the internet. And they also need to have the digital skills, not just for the children, but also for their caregivers, whoever they may be. So it's very important to have both access to the appropriate connectivity and to the devices that are most useful, and as well as the digital skills. So that includes a whole host of things, not just the IT support, but then also training and the understanding of how to be healthy digital citizens as well. You know, as we see more and more essential services moving online, it's really important for everybody to be able to fully participate, to have access. We also see this as an important part of the resilient delivery of these types of services. There is value to institutions actually having access available through the internet for resilience against natural disasters or any kind of other move. In the United States, we've seen a move out of in-person schooling because of the pandemic, but also because of wildfires. There can be in-person disruption for a wide variety of reasons, and certainly those won't abate over the years to come. So it's important that all institutions can remain resilient, and that also leads to the question of all individuals have to have access to that same level of resilient access to the institutions as well.
Thank you, Amina. Now I want to invite Tom Harrison. He is Reader and Program Director at the School of Education and Director of Education at the Jubilee Center for Characters and Virtues of the University of Birmingham. So Tom, can I ask you to do your contribution?
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, and hello to everyone, and thank you very much indeed for having me today. The internet gets the knocking for many good reasons. I think the internet gets a knocking, and there's many things that enables it or means that it's kind of diminishing from our human flourishing as a collective flourishing. But in many ways, the internet has been the unsung hero of so much of global collaboration to tackle big issues and problems, and we've seen that very clearly within the pandemic. If I just think about my conversations today have been with my daughter next door who's studying online right now. I spoke to one of the biggest foster care groups in the UK earlier. All of their training has to move online. If we look at the news this morning about vaccine collaboration has had to happen online. So in many ways, the internet has been an unsung hero. And because of that, and primarily I think because it is the place that so many of us do our connections, collaborations, and importantly have a voice, I think the internet essentially should be considered a human right these days. The right to freedom of thought and expression, to defend our own rights, to be part of public discourse, so often depends on us having internet access these days, even down to how we communicate with our representative and policymakers more and more relies on us to actually have access to the internet. It can no doubt be a threat to our democratic rights, but it also so much underpins what it means to be a democracy, which essentially contributes to human rights more broadly. So yes, my answer to the first question is it should certainly be considered a human right.
Thank you, Tom. Now I want to ask Pierre Verlick. Pierre is the CEO of the Pop School in Paris and France. Pierre.
Thank you very much, Paul. Hello, everyone. My answer also will be quite clear. Yes, one cannot but notice that the internet is a key drive for both economic and social evolution. And digital tools have changed the way we live, the way we teach. They have changed healthcare, public services, business, and so on. And so being able to access the internet is therefore a prerequisite today for exercising and enjoying the rights to freedom of expression, of course, but also to access socio-economic opportunities. That's why I do believe that the right to internet access should be indeed considered a human right, and that states should make sure that everyone has access to the internet and that there is no, let's say, unjustified restrictions to individual access to internet. Now, your question focuses more particularly on human rights, and I find it really interesting. If we take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is obviously a milestone document that was proclaimed by the UN General Assembly, this common standard of achievements for all people and all nations was of course a creator of its time, 1948. But if you take Article 25 of the Declaration, it states that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. Well, now I'm guessing, but I'm quite sure and I'm quite convinced that should the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be proclaimed now, and should it be drafted now, such a document would of course include universal coverage of the internet and the right to internet access for everyone.
Thank you, Pierre. Janice Richardson. Janice is Inside International Advice on Literacy, Rights and Democracy in Luxembourg. Please, Janice.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Well, when we're speaking about rights, I think we first of all have to think about responsibility. Yes, universal coverage should be an international human right, but if the citizens don't understand their rights and don't understand that it's counterbalanced with a responsibility, then I think that we're seeing a situation pretty much as it is now with anyone saying anything. If we look at children's rights, children have the right to information, but today the internet is not necessarily giving information, perhaps a lot of disinformation. Also, free access to information, but with the algorithms today, we are pushing people into profiling, and this is very much against human rights. I think also having the internet, fine, knowing how to use it correctly is quite another thing. I see in schools today, we keep talking about awareness, but no, we should be talking about teaching children and adults how to use internet so that they really can use it for everything that it's meant to be used for. And then lastly, I would say children also have a right to parental guidance and the guidance of trusted adults around them. So we can't just give internet coverage as a right. We have to think about these responsibilities of all of the stakeholders.
Thank you, Janice. Now I want to invite Luci Pfeiffer. She's pediatrician, doctor in child and adolescent health and psychoanalyst, member of the SBP Working Group on Health in the Digital Age, and coordinator of the DEDICA program in Curitiba, Brazil. Let me see if she is, I think Luci is not present. Well, let's wait if Luci comes later. Then I want to go to Susan Walker. Susan is associate. Oh, Luci, you're there.
Yes, I'm here. I would like to thank you, the organization, Family Development, for the invitation, and I am very glad to be here with you, with all the important persons with different visions. Yes, and I take care of the children and adolescents that have damaged by the internet. I have a program in Curitiba, a good city to live, but we have many children that we need to treat, because the violence that comes from the real world and also to the internet world. And it's right, my answer is simple also. Yes, the internet is a big advance of the humanity. Is a human right for adults, for children, for adolescents, but we need to think about what internet we want to universalize, what internet we want to give to all the people. If we have today people of all social levels that use the internet, and people with all social levels that are problems with the things that the internet carry on, we need to think perhaps this is a big moment, a very important moment to see this and to protect not only those that are excluded until now, that is an inequality, is not a correct way to human rights, is an inequality, but perhaps this is a good moment to see what happened in these years of the internet that came with 4 billion, more than 4 billion lives, and what the internet brings to the good and to the bad. Is very important. And the ways to control this, because I see when I heard my patients that they are victims, very, very easy victims. It's very easy to do criminal minds to find a child or an adolescent. They can, with the technology, find the neglect, the adolescent that is many times, many hours on the internet. So I think it's a good path today. I think it's a good proposal to think about what internet we can and we want universalize.
Thank you, Lucy. So I want to give the word to Susan Walker. Susan is Associate Professor in Family Social Science and founder of the Parentopia Project of University of Minnesota, Minneapolis.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for welcoming to this group. It's wonderful. I have the disadvantage of going after a number of others of you, so let me echo my notes are exactly what you all have stated. I also would say a strong yes to the question from the standpoint, as it's been pointed out, all that the internet provides to individuals, to children, to families, in terms of sharing information and gathering information, and for entertainment and for education, and but also to have a voice and to be able to collaborate and in a very creative way. Also, because we do know that the lack of access to the internet just exacerbates the gaps in people's education and their educational achievement, but also for families in terms of their access to housing, their access to employment. For an increasing number of families, the internet is the way that they do work or they get to work. And so I think we also have to look at the basic functionalities that having access to the internet means for family life, not just for communication and for information, but also simply for access for families. And also, I completely agree about the need for responsibility, because it isn't just a matter of having access to the internet. We can even say that the internet is theoretically neutral, right? But it is how we use the internet. And I would say that for that level of responsibility, very naturally, you know, our focus is on the individual and the individual's ability to use digital technologies, and then within, for children, you know, looking within the family for their parents and how comfortable their parents are in using the technologies. And I know we're going to talk about that more today. But I would also call on for this, that if we are accepting this as a basic human right, and we do think of the idea of responsibility, that responsibility then goes at more macro levels, that the workplace, and I know we're going to be talking about this, but that the workplace and schools and other institutions that affect the family also take on the responsibility for the digital skills of their employees, for understanding how technology works and what it means to families, so that the responsibility is shared. Because one additional way that I would have us look at access, using technology for access, is not just what an individual or what a family has access to, but for us as service providers who work directly with families, as teachers, as counselors and therapists, as social service workers. I'm a parenting educator. You know, the internet also allows us access to families. And so if, as a basic human right, it makes my job easier. And when families are limited in internet access, and we aren't considering that at macro views in terms of countries' economics and what that means to helping families access the internet, it puts a barrier in service provision. and in education and in the delivery of health services to families. It puts a barrier in the way that employers can do business. And so as we're looking at it in terms of access, it isn't just the individual and the family, but it's also at a wider level, our ability to assist families.
Thank you, Susan. Now I want to give the word to Jessica Navarro. She's research assistant on human development and family studies at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. So Jessica.
Thank you. Like Susan said, I mean, there's been so much said that I really agree with, and I've been so inspired by so many of your responses. I just have a couple of quick things to add, and really echoing what Susan said as a family scientist. I really think that access is really important to address a lot of the social and racial inequalities, particularly we see here in the United States. And a lot of that goes to employment, as Susan said, education, but I think there's another component we haven't talked about as much, and that is health, physical health, in addition to mental health. So access to health education information, as well as actually accessing healthcare itself, being able to access mental health care online, being able to visit the doctor online. These are incredibly important aspects of the internet, particularly today, and even more so for rural communities who might not have access to that type of information or those type of experts from their home. And we have a big divide in the United States in terms of access to the internet in rural areas compared to urban areas, and we see large discrepancies in health outcomes. And so I think in terms of health, that being access to healthcare being a human right, this is a key component of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
I think it's a very good question. I would say yes, of course, but maybe also giving some perspective on what is right. I think it was talking about even more about talking about realizing, implementing rights than just, you know, a legal text saying this is a human right. I just want to give an example of Togo, which is one darling country of mine. I worked a lot in Togo in Africa. And in 1970, they put a law, a legislation saying primary school is mandatory for all children. 50 years later, meaning now, there is still like more than 20% of children that are actually not completing primary school. So yes, the answer, my short answer would be yes on your question. At the same time, I think it's important to do evidence generation and programs and policies that focus more on the implementation of rights rather than on just global advocacy about what is a right that is sometimes too much semantic debate, basically. And in relation to the internet, I think the elephant in the room is the equity issue linked to the digital divide. And of course, it is linked to access to connectivity, or even sometimes linked to access to electricity, leave alone internet, let alone internet. I don't know if you, I mean, I'm sure you know, in African countries, there are still so many countries with so low access to just electricity. I mean, just for the sake of this call, I look at the data. In Burundi, you have only 11% of the population that have electricity. Chad, 12%, and I can keep on. Burkina, 14%. DRC, Congo Democratic Republic, it's also 19%, and Madagascar, 25%. So, I mean, for me, the elephant in the room when we are talking about the access to the internet is, of course, this digital divide. We saw that with COVID, actually, we had already a learning crisis, a learning poverty, as well estimated by the World Bank, and the crisis has exacerbated those disparities, in particular due to the digital divide. Maybe I will stop here on this one because I think I may have done already my 2 minutes.
You might try to keep the 2 minutes because we have a lot of questions and a lot of people, but we're doing good. So now I want to read the second question. And the second question is, what are the best indicators to measure households' access to new technologies? So Tracy, can you start again?
I'm going to not answer the obvious part of it because I feel like I get to take all the easy pickings and then my colleagues have to sort of scrounge around for the sort of less obvious points that they may have prepared. I'll go slightly to the side, which is to say that I'm interested in your use of the words new technologies, because in a way, that's sort of terminology from, say, 10 years ago, right? So do we mean new technologies are the fancy machine in my kitchen? Do we mean new technologies are, you know, self-driving cars? So I think what we might want to do is be more specific about what we mean by technologies. I'm guessing you mean digital technologies and access to the internet, for example, that Matt was just talking about. But if we want to think about the future and you want to really sort of position this argument and this discussion in terms of designing and developing research and policy for sort of the next 5-10 years, then we also have to broaden the definition of technology to include things like, you know, not just watches and smart tech and stuff like that, but also biotech, and start talking about what do we actually mean about the frontiers of brain and computer interfaces, and what do we mean about human enhanced cognition? Because all of these things are already sort of percolating around in many of our discussions. And I think this is something we need to start incorporating into these discussions in order to be able to be prepared in 5 years or in 10 years. And if, just to give one example, the use of smart drugs to enhance human cognition, this is something that we have very little information about in the university sector. There's not very good understanding of how common it is, but it seems, at least from the studies I've seen from the UK, that it's up to 25% of students admit to taking some kind of enhancement, which would just be repurposing normally legal drugs, but repurposing for other purposes. And we don't know what that means for children. I mean, you see it coming to lower and lower ages, younger and younger children, repurposing Ritalin, for example, which is used for treating ADHD, and repurposing that to study and to give you a boost and enhance your memory. We don't know if it works. We don't know long-term effects of this kind of drug. And I think that those are also ways of thinking about technologies and enhancement and how we learn and how we are, that we need to also be thinking about when we want to measure these things. So I'll stop there, just having thrown a completely separate path into the discussion, but I think it might be useful to sort of keep that in mind also as we start talking about what some more traditional measures might be.
Thank you, Tracy. Amina.
Thank you. You know, the work that we've been doing at Common Sense has been digging into issues around assessments. You know, one thing that's sad to say is that equity is such a big part of what is driving inequalities in lack of equity is driving these inequalities in access to technology, right, up and down the scale. So lack of access to broadband means lack of access to a whole host of technologies. And so one thing that I would note is that it's really important for us to actually have some basic understanding of who has access to that basic underlying infrastructure. Everything you want to place on top, you know, all the new technologies in some way rely or depend on the access to not just the internet, but like we were saying before, an understanding of how to use the internet. One thing that's happened in the midst of the pandemic in the United States is that schools have taken on this role in doing assessments. That hadn't been done before. We didn't really have an institution that was looking into who had access to the internet of students and families, and what was their level of access, their level of understanding, what kind of devices did they have, what kind of support would they need. Those questions are now being asked. They're being asked more frequently. Schools are utilizing that to connect their students to distance learning. You know, one can imagine that information with appropriate privacy safeguards can be utilized by policymakers to better understand where there are gaps in connectivity in infrastructure, so actual lacking access to the underlying infrastructure, but then also gaps in other forms of broadband adoption, so cost, training, training for families, training for students, training for teachers. So I think all of this is really useful, and it's not as sexy as looking at what is, you know, kind of around the bend, but I do think that if we don't understand what our actual underlying infrastructure and sort of the basics of accessing technology actually look like, then we only further deepen that divide.
Thank you, Amina. Tom.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not an expert on this question, so I'm going to pretty much pass, apart from just saying a couple of comments, which us academics tend to do, which is kind of critique the question when we may not have an answer to it at this time. And I'm just going to follow Tracy's lead to some extent in the question around the kind of the idea or the conceptual understanding of what new technology is right now. I totally concur with Tracy in the fact that we need to be much sharper in our definition and conceptualizations of this, because this new technology area is so broad that it's actually we can get really lost just by those terms. And alongside that, the issues of data, which are clearly data's behind this question. You know, what data can we get on household use of technology is incredibly exciting in this digital world, because it's so easy to collect so much big data. You know, it's so easy to get that. But from my experience, that big data isn't always handled particularly well. So there's actually a lot of challenges around looking much beyond the broad statistics of how much internet use is or how many houses have technology. I argue more for qualitative measures in that space as well. What does this actually look like in the home, in the household, not just the raw figure of whether people have got smartphone, laptop, but it's actually the use and what the use of that technology. And the final thing is just to say within that question as well, kind of households access, we're lumping in a whole different members of the family within household access, what's been exposed by new technologies, and actually even things like the internet, which might even be classed as an old technology, as Tracy said, given, you know, kind of how much is up and coming right now, is actually that the digital divide may actually be going on within the household, that actually there is, and I don't particularly like the term digital natives, but that at least that gives an understanding that perhaps a lot of this new technology is in the proviso of kind of children and young people, and actually it's adults and others who are having to be more the digital immigrants in this sort of place, and actually have to move into those sorts of territories. So I'm afraid I haven't answered the questions, but I've certainly given hopefully a reasonable critique of the question.
It's clear. Thank you very much. Pierre.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, on this question, I think having accurate and qualified data and access to new technologies, whether we're talking about equipment or services, is a key player in the effectiveness and in the relevance of digital-related public policies. So I think it's a really good question that you're asking. I took a rather narrow definition of new technologies, and it seems to me that household access to new technologies can be measured by several key indicators. It goes without saying that for households to have access to digital tools and services, people need access to equipment and services that are well functioning. And the difficulties encountered by many households during coronavirus lockdowns underline that it is still a real challenge, and that not all households have access to functional equipments. So I'd say the first indicator to me would be quite basic, but it would be the proportion of households with a computer or another digital device, such as a tablet or smartphone, and that this device should be well functioning and really working. I think we could also pay attention to the number of devices with regards to the family size, because we have seen during the various COVID lockdown that it was not easy for some families to combine, for instance, homeschooling for children and teleworking for parents. So I think the number of devices is also really important. And then finally, the third indicator would obviously be, and I think it's quite basic, but I think it's worth mentioning, the actual access to a working internet. And it was not also the case everywhere in France, for instance, during the coronavirus lockdowns. So having qualified data is a key element for policymakers, but I would add that publishing them in open data is also really interesting for society to foster innovation, to have creative solutions emerging from within the society. And it would not be much longer.
Thank you. Janice.
Sorry, I'm muted. first of all, I think it's very important to know who wants these indicators. If it's a family organization, that's one thing. If it's the government, it's another. Secondly, in Luxembourg, every year we have the static survey, which asks us how many books we've read, how many times we've been to the theater, which in fact is very pedagogical because it makes you reflect on what you're doing rather than just the tools that you have. I've just completed for the Council of Europe a survey with 21,000 parents across 47 countries in Europe. And what we're seeing is very much what the last speaker pointed out. You can have wonderful broadband and also the right devices, but if everyone's using it at the same time, then there's no impact whatsoever. So I think that it always should be pro rata so that we can understand, do people have sufficient for their needs? Another thing that came up was printers. Schools expected children to print their homework, to write it out, to scan it, and then to send it back. It would have been very interesting for policymakers to already have these indicators beforehand, because really families had a huge problem and there are other ways to go around it. I'd also like as an indicator time, approximate time spent online. Not only would it give us a little idea of the broadband that would be required, but it also makes families reflect on how much time they're actually spending online. And then lastly, connected devices, because if you make families think about how many connected devices they have in the home, baby minders, those baby videos, for example, very few people who were equipped with these actually realized all the data was going to internet. So it could be a way, a pedagogical way to inform families if they had to think about which devices were connected.
Thank you, Denise. Luci.
So I agree with my colleagues. I agree. And I think that we need to share good information. We need to perhaps to know what we want. They are the number or the MAC number, media sex control address, that is unique for each device, connected device. This is perhaps very important. The sexted MAC fundamental either when to the identification of those who commit crimes through virtual means, including violence against children and adolescents. But what we will want, I think it's better that we know about what kind of media the child and the adolescents use, and what they do there, what they do in the media, and how much strange people they find there, and how accessible they are for the criminal minds, and how useful is the use for the families. In the time of coronavirus, our assistance, our consultations are transformed in online consultations. It works. Internet is a very good way, but the inequality was there. The inequality for those that are only one connected device for 5 or 6 in a house, or for not good internet. So I think that these numbers could be available for everyone, but they specify what is important to say about the use, about the good use to improve this, and about the bad use to ban or to teach more parents and children. I think it's better the quality, the information, that the number. But it's good to say, to know that there are one that we could find the device, the connect device, if the xerox that have the patent of this number permits to share. So I think it's a policy way to find people and connect devices, but for us, for the quality and the kind of equipment and the possibility to good things of the internet is more important.
Thank you, Lucy. Susan.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to go with Tom's response and pick apart the prompt. Because as I think about this as a researcher and having troubles with data that's been collected at the household level, find all kinds of problems when we're talking about families and when we're talking about families with children. And I can't do better than Tracy's discussion of what we mean by new technologies, because I completely agree that we need to expand that definition. And but I think when we're looking at this question, primarily what always strikes me is for what outcome, right? So what we're looking at indicators to measure household access of new technology. But I think if we're thinking for what outcome are we caring about, I think that's going to change not only how we define household, but it's also going to define how we define or how we look at access, and obviously how we're looking at new technologies. So, you know, and maybe this is just from taking lots of census data and then determining that it's not very useful because it's too big, it's too broad, it's not specific enough. I think especially with households, we need to look at it isn't just a matter of a household, but is it a household with children? And if it's a household with children, are there caregivers? And then who are those caregivers? And then specifically, if we're looking at children, what are the ages of children? Because definitely if we're looking at young children, or we're looking at teenagers, or we're looking at young adults, or how many children there are in the family, right? I mean, all of these demographics within the family make a big difference, again, related to those outcomes. And then the word access too, I think very much depends on, you know, what our outcome is, our outcome of interest is, in the sense of access for me isn't just having access, but it's, as we talked about in the first question, the skills to be able to use technology. And so when I look at within family differences and across family differences, I see differences clearly in the skills as well as attitudes towards using technology, skill differences within that family between children and their families, which are their parents, which can set up a power differential. But then also, and I think this was mentioned before, it isn't just does a household have access to the internet, or do they have access to a particular, you know, a smartphone or to a cell phone, but within a family, I think that point about the number of devices is key. Because, you know, I know with the last few years as we've been doing more work with schools, you know, there are these privilege differences where in one household there can be multiple devices, and a child can have access to a laptop and monitors and tablets and smartphones and all kinds of things. And for another family, a single smartphone is the technology used by the entire family. And so access is a good word, but again, it kind of depends on what we care about. So I would just ask, as we pick apart that prompt, that we care more about how we define household, how we define access, and obviously how we define new technology.
Thank you. Jessica.
After another family scientist, I'm just a mirror to that, really. But in my county, for example, if you look at the statistics for who has broadband coverage, it's 89%. If you include smartphones, that gets up to 96%. Well, that's great, right? Everybody has access, but exactly like Susan said, it really depends on the family structure. It depends on how many of those devices are in the home and what type of devices they are. So we have children in our county who are attending school remotely on smartphones, and that's not the same type of access as a student in the same class who's attending over a PC. And then also, in addition to the number of devices in the home, we get into the type of broadband that's in that home. So if you have one child in the home, for example, attending school and one parent, maybe, I don't know, half a gig might be enough, right, for that whole family. But if you get larger families and they're all trying to access streaming information at the same time, attending school, attending work, having conferences with doctors, that becomes really difficult when you have that many people using that amount. I don't know the exact technical word, but that amount of the broadband, in that location. So I think that's another important piece too. It's just not about the number of devices. It's about how do you match that up to the access to the speed of the internet and that they are getting. And then also, just in addition to education, again, the smartphone access really depends in terms of employment. So being able to apply for jobs, creating a resume on a smartphone is very, very challenging. So it really depends on the type of device, the cost of those devices in a particular area, the number of devices, the structure of the family. I think it's just so much more complex simply than saying, oh, we have 89% broadband in our county. It's sort of it's misleading.
Thank you.
So on this one, there is some household survey, in particular mixed surveys that UNICEF is supporting a lot in many countries, that started to include a simple question to households. It's a household survey, so it's question to household heads usually, about the ICT skills and the adolescents in the household with those ICT skills and use of ICT, but it's really limited in some ways and mainly self-reported. It means we are not really testing the skills on ICT, access to technology and skills. I know that ITU has some data and indicators. I would not be a specialist to have a specific wording of the right indicators, but even for this one, I think access is one thing, but to use is another thing. And we still have too many countries where there are a lot of gender and social norms that actually sometimes prevent children to let their children accessing internet, in particular girls. We just did a blog using mixed data. There are also survey data showing that in sub-Saharan Africa, you have like so many barriers that are soft barriers, not hard barriers, not like having connectivity on a computer, that are actually, I think, as important as the hard barriers. But I don't know enough about the best indicators. Sorry about that. It's just some reflection I had on the topic.
Just a way to work more. So, Tracy.
I think this is what we call a leading question. Perhaps it's a way to work less. I'll be brief. I think that there's some very good research that demonstrates sort of the way that you can telework. It not just reduces commuter time, obviously, and it allows for contributions for people who are maybe not as mobile and are able to get out and take part in the workforce when they wouldn't necessarily be as able to do that if there wasn't a digital way or a teleworking way to do that. But it also, of course, permits flexible use of your time so that you're able to take care or put a load of washing on while you're in the middle of doing something else. Or I think that there are a number of reasons to argue that teleworking is part of the suite of flexible working measures, which on the whole allow people to work well, to work better, which with the goal of balancing family life and work life and personal life and sort of personal well-being. That being said, I think there is a very big asterisk beside it. I think we do tend to get sort of sucked in. And I think this, this sort of Zoom fatigue that we all know and have observed during the COVID period is a reminder that interactions over the screen are more tiring and draining than those in real life. And so one of the things I think is that we don't always separate our work time and our work functions from our personal time and personal functions. And increasingly we see, of course, the way the digital and screens have sort of integrated into children's lives and parents' fun times with children. You just, in many cases, can have just extensive amounts of time on the screen, whether it's work or personal. And I think that also makes it hard to make the distinction between them. But to sum up, I would actually think that it contributes to balance, but it is, of course, the devil is in the detail, and it's all about how you as an adult manage that time, and also the kinds of interactions you have with your family, and making, of course, sure that they're not all screen-based. And so you don't just have this blend between work and personal, which you can't actually even distinguish well.
Thank you, Tracy. Amina.
Thanks. This is coming from a parent who has a 3-year-old in another room, and I'm fully expecting him to run in and bomb us any moment with his lovely face. Yeah, so I mean, I can say that, you know, when you mix these worlds, you know, there are advantages for sure. And, you know, for vulnerable families whose parents are unable to work from home, the difference in what is able to sort of continue as normal is drastic. So, you know, the ability of parents to spend more time and engage with their children in the midst of a pandemic, to feel safe about working outside the home and coming back in, that's very difficult. If you're working outside the home, you naturally are concerned about health and disease in this day and age. And then there are additional concerns around education. If you are doing remote learning and you're not able to have a caregiver in the home while children are at home doing some kind of remote education, it's a known fact that that remote education is not as fruitful. It's very difficult for children to navigate that environment depending on their age. And then on top of that, it's hard to make sure that everybody is staying on task. So there's a new role for caregivers at home. And so that's the sort of push-pull. You know, maybe you've got the advantage of working from home, you get to be there. But then also you're taking time out from your own work to be able to do that additional support for your child. Again, if you aren't privileged enough to work from home, then you don't even have that option. And so what we're seeing is that either kids are grouping up on their own, potentially just falling off altogether and not showing up to any classes. We've had, you know, sort of the missing children from distance learning education. That's a huge issue in the United States with respect to distance learning. And then, you know, children are going outside the home to be able to do remote work, remote learning, because their caregivers are not in the home because they are working outside. So not having access to remote work is a significant disadvantage when you do, again, need to rely on the resilience of technology to be able to shift learning, work, healthcare, et cetera.
Thank you, Amina. Tom.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a natural experiment almost gone on with the pandemic, with so much moving to working at home. And I think there's probably a clue in the answer to some extent by how surprised businesses have been at their efficiency rates, and their profits, etc., have not actually been affected by the amount of home working in many ways. Actually, the move to home working was smoother than I think a lot of businesses who probably resisted the move to home working for many years suspected. So there's probably a clue in the answer there. But I would argue it's probably not so much work more, it's perhaps work differently, and this has already been mentioned by the other contributors. You know, and I imagine some of that working differently is for good, and some of it is not so good as you'd expect. What might be the difference between you know, home working and family balance for the good and not so good? I I'm inclined to apply a bit of a kind of a moral theory perspective to this, about which kind of informs the sorts of behaviour and the judgments and the choices we make. And my work and others has shown that kind of traditional ways of managing ourselves and also kind of managing what we do around kind of regulation rules tends not to work so well in digital and internet-based environments. And that's clearly the case, although there's a lot of ways that people try to manage home working, which hours people are logged on and when they're using. Clearly those sorts of kind of in work location ways of managing those through rules is very different when home working's there. Research also shows we tend to be not so good at understanding our consequences of our actions. I know that myself. I struggle to know, you know, actually what spending this amount of time in front of the Zoom is actually doing to myself, how I'm able to kind of actually move away from that, and you know, kind of what sort of exemplar that I'm actually being to my own children in using these technologies as well. So, you know, kind of carrots and sticks, or the rules and exemplars type way of managing you know, our home life balance is somewhat changed by you know, working from home more, and therefore the emphasis I would say is much more, and I think this has been already mentioned, on ourselves, and what I would argue is our character and who we are. It comes down much more to get this work-life balance down to our own resilience, our own good judgment, our own kind of compassion and courage in many ways in these sorts of spaces. It's much more as emphasis on us, I think, to ensure that this home working is actually gets a good rather than a negative effect on our work and life balance.
Thank you, Tom. Pierre.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, on the one hand, we can obviously see that telework is a way to better balance professional and family responsibilities, and it has many advantages, as Tracy stated earlier. Of course, it allows for more flexible schedules, enabling us to be more, I'd say, present at the good time for our family, and not just only when you come home from work. It avoids traveling to the office, and it enables us to be closer to our family. That is obviously the bright side of teleworking. And on the other hand, we may also underline, I think, the risk of working more from home, which could we could think about, for instance, extending schedules or difficulties when it comes to logging out from your device and from work. And I think it's quite a personal experience for me, so I'm happy to share it. And it may lead also teleworkers to a conflict between work and family responsibilities in the end. So needless to say that coronavirus pandemic crisis has highly accelerated the introduction of telework on a large scale. And in the end, it is a new wave of working. And as with any new practice, I do believe we all have to learn on a daily basis, and that we should all have access to, let's say, recommendations and resources on the benefits and the risks of teleworking. For some, this may mean establishing login and logout rules with specific hours, or having access to a specific office space that is, let's say, respected by the rest of the family, and so on. And finally, this might be very French to say as the measure was implemented a few years ago in France, but I do believe it is essential for social partners to work on a framework regarding the right to disconnect, so as to reduce employees' exhaustions, whether physical or emotional, and to address potential concerns for worker well-being.
Thank you, Pierre. Janice.
Yes, I think that Pierre said one very essential word: respect. My husband and I have been working from home now for about 6 years, inspired by the book by Semler, Ricardo Semler, who in fact had his own business and discovered if people could work from where they wanted, when they wanted, the output was much greater. I also work with my team like this, and do find that we work on output and not on hours. However, I think that there are 3 basic rules. When you're working from home, you're working. And if you have to look after your child at the same time as many parents were forced to do during remote schooling, this is not fair to the parent, not fair to the child. So when you're working from home, I think you have to discipline yourself like this. Secondly, when we all began having mobile phones and being ready to respond to an email at midnight, we got ourselves into very bad habits. And I think that this is also respect. You have to set the rules and ensure that your boss knows that you're not going to be answering any question after a certain hour. I think also, yes, resilience is very important. I work with a lot of young people aged 14 to 22, and they're all telling me that having online meetings, even in their school, puts a lot of pressure on them. They become very self-conscious, and there is no one to turn to when you have a problem. So I think if these things are respected, if you break your day down and use it properly to go for a walk after lunch or whatever, then I think that it can be really a means of balancing work, family, physical exercise. But until we start respecting these things and getting employers to respect these things, I think that it's actually detracting from family time. Nothing's worse than someone sitting at a birthday party and answering an email because it's urgent from the boss.
Thank you. Luci.
It's easier to talk later because you have already say, I think, everything that is important. But I think that the teleworking, we need to separate the teleworking that we have done in the time of COVID, of the isolation. That is, we need a fast adaptation to this kind of work, and also the adaptation to have the children 24 hours a day with us. It's not a easy way to work. Yes, and you said about this, and it's different from if we talk about the teleworking that is plain, that is a choice, that is we prepare an ambient, and we need to make the difference because this nowadays we are working at home in not for choose this kind, but there are much people that like very much to like to work like that, and I think we need some care, some like Jenny said. The work is one way to work more. It depends on the type of use that the workers and employers will define as the best form. Respect the travelist rights need to give the ways to this kind of work, and it's advantage to be at home, to time to reduce to go to work, and the possibility of healthy food and more children dedication time, perhaps, because for people that can share with the partner, the parents that can time, one time to take care of the children and one time to take to work, and after this they change it is good, but it's not even possible. The possibility of colleagues and specialists for other places to share experiences a very good thing, but we need to pay attention also with the effect to isolation, to stay at home at a room without talk about other things, to talk about to talk about things that is not only for the world. The hybrid system, when possible, with necessary protection, decrease the level of stress and psychic effects of prolonged isolation all the time, not only on the COVID time. Online work that is a woman right, sure, but it should be possible for everyone. But I think there is necessary new rules for that.
Thank you, Lucy. Susan.
Thank you. A few things. One is, I think when we are looking at the idea of balance, it depends on what we mean by balance, and especially for the individual, right? Because, are we talking about individuals' mental health? Are we talking about family level concerns? And I think before we start adding in technology, we need to just think about what work-family balance means generally, and be very careful that our view on this isn't too white and too Euro-focused, when work and family is defined so differently depending on the country and depending on the type of work. And there are different cultural perspectives on that balance of work and family. And so in some cultures, spending more time at work is a way of taking care of your family. And so, so I think that the question just needs to be quite broad to understand the variety. And also when we think about balance, I am going to throw in the gender point here, and because I think that also depends on balance for who. And that idea of balance is getting the job done depending on roles and responsibilities and depending on space and time and all of those different dimensions. And oftentimes when we are looking at that blend of having work demands and family demands, it does fall on women. And it falls on women in both spheres. And if you look at a lot of the traditional work-family policies, they've been aimed at flexibility around hours, around childcare, around leave. And so, and they've resulted in more women in the workplace, but they alone, without technology, haven't really been implemented successfully yet, right? And so, so I think that this question definitely has to be it depends, and looking at gender equity and where our policies are so far in establishing that balance, for women especially. And then the other thing I would add is when we're talking about, is it a way to work? I think when we're looking at technology, we also have to think of, is it a way that families can work at all? Because technology is definitely shaping work. If we think about the gig economy, we think about digital nomads, we think about the way that in fact, there are some that are arguing that we are no longer looking at sort of bounded spaces and times to do homework and to do family or work, but we're really looking at this idea of mobility, right? And it's definitely making work possible for a lot of families. So it isn't necessarily that we're working at home, it's simply that technology is allowing work. And then finally, when it comes down to it, and we are going to be talking about this, in February, largely when it comes to technology, it depends. There is so much we don't know, and there's so many different factors, whether we're talking about the workplace, whether we're talking work expectations or family expectations, or how the individual is managing. But as a lot of people have already mentioned this morning, a lot of people are just, this was also our current situation. We need employers, I think, need to provide more supports at an individual level to help to tailor so that an individual parent, an individual family member, worker is developing more of what's being called digital cultural capital. To have a better understanding of how you use these different technologies to fulfill these individual roles and needs. And sorry, there was one other really important thing, but I am going to stop for the sake of time.
Susan. Jessica.
Thank you. Yeah, my answer is exactly that it totally depends. And I would say that when we're talking about work-family balance, we're not just talking about the, you know, how that impacts the family, but also how it impacts the workplace, right? And how it impacts the quality of work that people are able to do and how they feel about that. So, you know, I know in my particular case, I have 3 children here at home with me. That's constantly impacting the quality of work that I'm able to do. And so it's not just about the balance within the family, but it's also about how it impacts work. And, you know, I think it's really difficult to say at this point from a research perspective, because all the research that I would rely upon is done pre-COVID. But in general, you know, it really, really depends. I think it depends a lot on the type of job. So we're obviously talking about a lot of white collar jobs. A lot of blue collar jobs don't have access to this type of remote work. And that's something that, particularly in times of COVID, I think we've seen really play out in terms of an inequality. So just, you know, to make sure that we think about that and acknowledge that this really is sort of a more middle class issue. And so that's important. But then again, it definitely depends on gender. You know, women are seen as primary caregivers. It disproportionately affects them. And also there's this sort of cultural acceptance, right, of men working after hours a lot of times. But then at the same time, when given the flexibility by organizations, men often don't take it. They don't often take paternity leave, for example, because of the cultural norms around that. So there's a lot of the ways in which family roles and gender play into this. I think it also depends a lot on personality and person characteristics. So a person's ability to psychologically detach from work, that plays a huge role, right? Employees' ambition and their investment in their workplace, that plays another role in their ability to set boundaries. So there's all these person level characteristics that go on as well. And then the organizational culture, right? So organizations that promote separation between the two spheres and those that don't. And so we see that play out and how that is influenced by federal policies like Pierre was talking about. So it's just multi-levels in which ways this, you know, it's all dependent on all these different factors. Yeah, thank you.
Interesting question. Maybe a bit north-oriented question, if I can be a bit challenging. Again, due to the digital divide, I should admit I don't have a strong opinion on this. I'm living alone, so for me it was working more, but I didn't need to have some work-family balance because I don't have kids, and I mean, COVID was an opportunity for me to reconnect more with my parents, but it's my personal case. And I know some colleagues have struggled more having to deal with both the work and the family and helping their kids because the schools were closed. I remember this colleague of mine telling me, I have the impression to do bad, both my father life, my father job and my job. Again, with an equity perspective, I'm from UNICEF, so of course I have an equity perspective. In African countries, you know, there is between 85% to 90% of the jobs that are in the informal sector. So if we are talking about those households, those people that I think we should talk about, they are mainly working in agriculture and non-formal jobs in the streets. And teleworking is not even an option in that case. So the question is not even their question, I would say. But yeah, I will stop here on this one.
Can the remote learning experience of COVID-19 help to improve education? Tracy.
Okay, I'm going to warn you in advance that I'll take a little bit of extra time on this question and shorten my answer to the one after this, because this is where my work is focused. My answer to this question would be yes, and I will give 3 main elements. The first is connected to what Jessica was just talking about on this sort of equality piece. So the obvious effect of COVID, you know, we've heard a lot of headlines, etc., and concerns about learning loss and the most vulnerable children being the most at risk, etc. I think this is not new, right? These are the same vulnerable children. We know who these kids are. We know who these families are. This has been 100 years. It's the same risk profile. And what we haven't had is a way to try and address it. I mean, it's not just education's problem. It's not just housing's problem. It's not just health problem. This is something that we have been challenged with as societies, worldwide. And I'll speak to OECD countries because that's what I know. But what COVID did was shine a light on the weaknesses in our system and reminded us and put some urgency behind the kids who fall behind. And there are many individual reasons, of course, learning difficulties, etc. But systematically, when we think on a systems level, we know who is at risk. And COVID only reminded us and sort of really made that clear. And so on the one of my really big hopes for this is that this urgency that's behind solving this and sort of mitigating learning losses and worrying about the most vulnerable, that is very present now in our discussions. I hope that we can continue to keep that focus, because it's very easy to sort of marginalize and forget those most disenfranchised, those with the least digital skills, those with the parents who are least able to help them with their homework. I mean, it's a very clear category of kids who are at risk on multiple levels, and we have not done them justice. We have failed them on many respects, and I think we need to do better. So that's the first, my first hope is, yes, I do believe education will change. And I think the really big clarion call that I'd like to see is to really take seriously these long-standing issues of equity and really hope that we can start to address those in a systematic and thorough way, because it's overdue. The second point I'd like to make, and this is more about sort of the structures, I also think COVID, and I'm hopeful here, it was a massive disruptor, and disruptor can, it causes pain, but it can also lead to growth. And I think the opportunities that emerge for education from this disruptive period are actually huge. We've already seen in many OECD countries, we've seen sort of the tech infrastructure, the broadband connectivity, access to devices, those kinds of things. We've seen that be very seriously addressed. A lot of programs rolling out, making sure kids have access to devices, or in countries where that wasn't possible, Mexico is a great example, putting lessons on the TV or on radio so that kids can actually access it who don't have broadband at home, who don't have the devices. So I think that one big thing is we're going to see renewed interest and sort of attention paid to the infrastructure from broadband to devices. I do want to, I do hope that that's not taken to be sort of a magic solution, that if you give everybody a laptop that they will suddenly be able to learn. We've already gone down that path, and it's quite expensive and it's not very effective. So we need to understand that devices are not a solution. It's learning and teaching that is going to make the difference. But of course, it always helps to have a device that's up to date and useful. But also additionally, one of the big challenges is trying to sort of think about how to revolutionize and rethink pedagogies to use technology and the potential of technology. And what we see on average is that pedagogies are often using our limited use of technology, or using technology in ways that just kind of replicate the standard non-technological way of teaching. And some of that, there's good reasons for that, which I don't have time to get into, but one of the hopes is that by sort of a sort of forced immersion, there's been a lot of innovation, a lot of really amazing sort of, gutsy, if I may say so, teachers on the firing line having to come up with new solutions and go digital overnight. There's been an amazing sort of rethinking of, well, how can I use these tools to change the way I teach? Not just how can I teach the same way by the internet, but I can use potential and revolutionize my teaching. And I think that's a super interesting conversation that I'd like to see continuing, and I hope does. And of course, all those questions around assessment, what skills count? How do we want to measure them? What's the best way to measure them? I'm hopeful that we can actually have also conversations around, are our assessment mechanisms for both, younger children and older children, are they up to date? Are they measuring what we want to measure? We talk a lot about academic outcomes, but increasingly school is, of course, we're expected to produce citizens. So that also means sort of mental health and emotional well-being and pro-social behaviors and sort of physically healthy, body and soul. And I think that if we have those expectations for education, we also have to think about what we're assessing. the whole social and emotional piece, which we know is so fundamental, not just for education and citizenship, but for employment. We do a very bad job of assessing those. And it doesn't help your university entrance normally to play well with others. I mean, this is a sort of an indictment of many of our sort of narrow ways of defining things. And so I think we've opened up a lot of those discussions and put some renewed energy into those things. And the last thing I wanted to say is just the other thing that I've really seen, and it was very interesting, is, I live in France. And so when Macron said that they were closing schools, there were all these videos of teenagers at home who were watching and who were all standing up like, yeah, schools are closed, it's great. And 2 weeks in, they were sort of like, I kind of miss school. Like, I didn't, I never was going to say this, but now I kind of miss my friends and I kind of miss my teachers. And what this did was remind us that schools are the social fabric of our communities. It's not just the building, right? And so when we talk about education, it's really sort of fundamentally thinking about reminding ourselves about that sort of social element, reminding ourselves about the importance of face-to-face, of being able to hug someone. I mean, we're all dying.
Tracy, you're on 7 minutes.
Okay, I'll have one last thing just to say. Obviously, I care a lot about this. I'm going to skip my answer to the next question, and just to say there's an importance thinking about well-being. That's my last thing, to think about well-being and to really add that to the education thing. Sorry about that.
Don't worry. Thank you, Tracy. I just want to remind, look, I'm also the timekeeper, and we still have we have 5 questions. So please try to focus on the 2 minutes. And of course, sometimes maybe you can go a little bit longer and another question shorter, but try to have the average of the 2 minutes, okay? So Amina.
Thanks. I think this is a great question. The way to focus on it for me will be through the lens of equity to access to education. So equitable access to education. I think one thing that we've learned through the pandemic is that, we've seen the importance of access to internet as a delivery mechanism to continue sort of that resilient access to education. So to me, I think there's been a lot that has occurred since March to demonstrate all the sort of creative ways that we've been trying to drive towards that resilient access to education. In the United States, they've used television and other forms of media to deliver education, as well as using the internet. And what schools have done is they're starting to iterate on how to remain resilient. So, initially in spring, you saw sort of this, how do we get things out the door? How do we sort of start, when schools are shuttering? I think since then, there's been more long-term thinking, and schools are taking this sort of primary role in trying to understand, okay, how do we deliver access to education no matter what is going on in our community, no matter what happens, and how do we build the curriculum to be delivered in that way, so that, in-school curriculum can't easily just be flipped on a switch and delivered through the internet. And sometimes it's not as successful if it's just sort of done in the most simplistic way. So through this process, I think we've seen educators really dig in and learn, not just, okay, how do I assess the digital inclusion needs of my students, teachers, and caregivers? So, again, connectivity, devices, hard questions around, what can you do with that? So, not everybody can answer, oh, I have 100 Mbps down and 10 up. That's what the wonks can say, maybe. I might not even know what my internet access speeds actually are. So finding creative ways to ask those questions so that they can actually get high quality data back. That's one thing educators have iterated on, which has been really interesting, asking questions around digital inclusion. When they started standing up digital distance learning programs, they started to understand all the other pieces that need to also be included, like IT support and distance digital inclusion supports around digital citizenship and training. And then I think what we started to see is, you know, digging in on figuring out how to develop that curriculum, teacher training, training families to be able to use that curriculum. So there's a whole host of sort of tools that schools now understand are sort of prerequisites to being able to engage meaningfully with technology in the delivery of education. You know, we've sort of very quickly, because of the pandemic, gone between sort of simply just assuming, okay, the internet can deliver access to education, and then really realizing what are all the components to being able to do that. So that's been really wonderful to see, that sort of deeper thinking that's starting to develop across the educational institutions. And I think that's really hopeful. I think that'll lead to creative uses of technology outside of the pandemic to deliver. Okay, to deliver wraparound supports, social emotional learning, and access to therapists and access to social experiences as well. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thanks. Tom.
Yeah, I mean, the actual question is, can remote learning experiences COVID-19 help improve education? And the reason I say yes wholeheartedly is because it's really shine a light on what we're actually missing by having online learning as the main form of education for so many of our children. It's actually, what it's done is shine lights on the absence of that. And I say that as an advocate of online learning. I set up a fully online master's program 5 years ago. I've got access to students around the world. I'm bringing people together, collaborative conversations on big, important topics that otherwise wouldn't happen unless we had online learning going on. I've got people who are able to learn with me who wouldn't be able to otherwise because it works flexibly in the way they are. There is so many great things in online learning. I research in this area. I'm an advocate of it. But it is not the same as bringing people into schools and having that human contact that Tracy and others have already mentioned on, that is so essential and important to what I would say is a proper full education. There's things that technology can do to improve that, these online events, you know, discussion boards, etc. But it's not the same as actually being there and in person and having that human contact. And my concern with online learning is the danger is it becomes much more transactional than transformative. It's about transmitting knowledge, it's about people passing exams, it's about people getting assessments and learning knowledge, but where is the transformative elements of that? And the transformative elements are the parts that Tracy and others have mentioned about kind of a focus on kind of on well-being, or a focus on the kind of character qualities and the values and the social emotional learning that makes us human, but also makes us the sorts of people that employers want us to actually have working for them. I've recently published a paper calling "Where is the character education in distance education?" Where do we actually develop those sorts of qualities through distance education? It's great to hear the OECD and others are really taking this very seriously, I know, as part of what they're actually doing. So my answer to that question is yes, because it's shined a real clear light on what we are actually missing.
Pierre.
Yes, my answer will also be yes. From an innovation point of view, when faced with an unexpected situation, as Tracy said earlier, we might find more resources or stimulus to innovate. And I found it really interesting to see that some studies found that during the coronavirus lockdown, more creative tasks had taken place at home school than normal, whether we talk about digital escape rooms or science experiments. So in the end, this may gives us some inspiration for more innovation in schools' daily activities. But of course, we also have experienced a lot of difficulties with remote learning, how to use some specific tools, how to teach from home, how to conduct, let's say, dynamic activities and keep pupil attention, or even how to make pupils with learning difficulties stay on the good track. I think remote learnings require preparation and training for teachers. The supply of content is obviously, the supply of content through digital tools is not enough to produce learning, as was said earlier by my colleague. So we should pay attention to people's engagement and monitor learning behaviors and outcomes. So in the end, it seems clear to me that we do have a lot to learn from the remote experience of coronavirus when it comes to education. And I think it gives us an opportunity to rethink education and to focus on what really matters and to build education systems that enables children to learn both in schools and at home.
Thank you, Pierre. Janice?
Yes, well, I actually come from the land of remote learning, Australia, where we've had remote learning for the last 70 years through necessity. I think that the COVID experience has helped improve education, but it's still so closed. There is very little thinking out of the box. It has actually integrated technology for real outputs and real learning before it was just an add-on. So from that point of view, I think that it's done a good job. But schools need to think together much more because schools were using different platforms from one class to the other. Parents are complaining that their kids had to register to 5 or 6 different platforms. Schools were using tools that are meant for commercial use. And we discovered very early on all the problems with Zoom, which have been ironed out now. The whole organization bit needs much more thought from the education ministry, but also from schools in a holistic approach. The survey that I mentioned, and since then we've done 100 interviews with parents, and what we discover is that children who had support for learning in the classroom due to a learning disability just did not see their learning support for the whole length of the time when schools were in lockdown, and this is across 47 countries. The other thing is, although it shone the light on the importance of social emotional learning and well-being, I still see very little about soft skills being taught online. I see a lot of mathematics, history, geography, but I see very little real work where kids can start learning these continue learning their soft skills. And I think we need a whole lot more innovation in that regards. Also, one-on-one interviews, one-on-one moments with the teacher is very important. Maybe there are some good practices somewhere, but I haven't seen this either, where when children are struggling, they can have a one-on-one session. It's very embarrassing for children because you see the background of where they're learning from, and a lot of children are embarrassed about that. So I think it has improved education, especially as Tracy said, from looking at programs right through to evaluation, but I think we've only touched the tip of the iceberg, and there is so much more work to do, and this is our role now to go ahead with this, to think out of the box. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. Lucy.
I accompanied many children in remote learning, and it seems that for the little ones, it doesn't work very well because the little ones need the presence, the face, like Tracy said. They need to share things, they need movement. And it depends, the improved education, we need to talk about age, about mental capacity, the mental development, to consider that this that I give to the children is good and is improving really this education, her education. So I think we are so many topics to consider. The first one, the age. It's impossible for one child of 6, 7 years old to stay in front of a screen about 30, 40, 50 minutes. So it's difficult to learn, to teach it to learn. It depends also of the resources. The resources for the family, and is it possible also to have 4 hours of classes in cellular. It's impossible to learn in a device like that. Also, is a big difference to teach when you talk about the organization, the schools that could have money to prepare a good material and adapt it to the remote teach, and the others one. So the children and the adolescents had many losses because many governments have considered that the classes that are made, sorry by the English, that are made in a TV, in a professor that speak for 40, 50 minutes. It doesn't matter if the children is there, if the adolescent is there. These many governments of the world have considered that the classes is done, the education is done. So we have in this way, this time of COVID, a lot of loss for the children and adolescents about education. Also, we think, I think that for the adolescents, the success about the internet learning is more probable, but will depend on the program, the teacher, the technology, research for both sides, students and school. The interactive way seems to have given much better results because even the adolescents need the presence, need the interaction, need to see the other, and need to have the opportunity to ask questions. When the classes are given in a remote way only, all of this is not possible.
Luci, you are on 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Is that? Thank you.
Thank you, Luci. Susan.
Thank you. I'm going to use Tracy's wonderful structure and response to the question to frame my own and anything I might have to add. So first, I absolutely agree that my answer to the question would be yes, but it depends on equality and it depends on access. In my class, to undergraduates, I share a picture of 2 children sitting outside of a Taco Bell, and that was their internet access, was to sit outside the building and to bootleg. And so, and access in terms of education also means who's in the home to complement the learning and to help children with their technology, with their learning. And again, the device access at home. And so, and then we think about the range of children, right? And the range of families. So especially homeless families and families with children with special needs. And then access related to language. So, so again, equity, and we broaden out the idea of families. The second, in terms of structure and growth and opportunities, I absolutely agree as well. And I think that from the idea of what this has exposed, it definitely, and in my world, I see this all the time, that it has exposed the need for not only teachers to be trained and to use the technologies effectively, but also, I think it also exposed a tremendous problem for administrators of schools in the sense that they weren't ready. And so in terms of, they may have individual approaches to teaching teachers about technology or using it in classrooms or things like that, but for a whole system-wide approach, I know a lot of administrators were really trying to catch up and figure out what to do. But I think this idea of opportunity and structure and training also has to do with the other people who work with families. And so that there are wonderful standards that are available for teachers in terms of their use of technology. But when you look at other professions that work directly with families, they're really behind in terms of attending to technology for service delivery, for digital ethics, for things like that. So again, when we look at what this has exposed in terms of structure, you know, I think it has gone beyond schools in terms of education and support to families. And then finally, the idea about whole children, the whole child approach is absolutely right on, and that schools can only do so much, but schools do more than we give them credit for, and in terms of developing children's social and emotional, their character building, things like that. And yes, Tom, I want to read your paper. And I'll just again put in a plug for parents, because in the absence of children going to these physical school buildings and having the exposure of school for their own character development, that development of the whole child has really fallen even to a greater extent on families. Parents were never set up to be that 24/7. So, you know, in these supports that we're offering, as we're understanding the impact of COVID, again, I think if we have a stronger family approach and more supports to families and supports to those who work with families, that'll just be a necessary part of the picture.
Thanks, Susan. Jessica?
Thank you. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think you guys have covered so much, but I will just say that if I had $1 for every time I heard a parent recently say how much they appreciate their teachers and how much they recognize that their teachers do for their children and the schools, I'd be a very rich person. I think this has really underscored how important teachers are and how important schools are to our communities. And I'm really hoping after this that we can take that appreciation and turn it into meaningful gains for them. So, you know, looking at school boards, looking at how we can increase pay for teachers, how we can increase professional development for teachers, and really support them and their training, as well as schools themselves. So thank you.
Thank you.
I was mentioning before, I think unfortunately COVID-19 has exacerbated pre-existing disparities on learning. I mean, again, due to the digital divide, due also to, you know, it's difficult to help your kids to learn how to read, for example, foundational skill, how to read, when you are yourself illiterate. And the economy kind of stop, and you have to find just ways and resources to just feed your big family. So I would say that the remote learning experience of COVID so far has mainly actually did damage, in particular for the poorest. As you know, pre-COVID, it was already 53% of children in low and middle income countries that were not able to read a simple text by the age of 10. And that is called the learning poverty rate. That's an estimate from the World Bank. In low-income countries, this learning poverty rate is 90%. 9 out of 10 kids are not able to read a simple text by the age of 10, even when they go to school. It is 10% of kids that don't go to school overall in the world. But even when they go to school, the quality of learning of teaching and learning is so improvable, to say the least, that actually we have this learning crisis. When we relate it to your topic, which is around, I guess, remote learning understood as online learning, even if, of course, some countries where there is no big connectivity has to find other ways of delivering remote education, like through radio, TV programs, and sometimes take-home package, learning material take-home package. If we are talking about online learning, the estimate we have done with UNICEF is only 1/4 of the children in the world were able to use online learning as a solution during school closures, 25%. And where are they? They are the wealthiest of the world. They are either in a wealthier country or they are the wealthiest families in the poor country. So again, my thinking is that we need, one, to, of course, increase electricity and connectivity, reducing the digital divide, and on the short term, because those things doesn't change overnight, on the short term, having also other remote learning solution when school have to close for health safety reasons.
Because we need to manage the time a little bit, is when the 2 minutes pass, I will just remind it out loud, okay? If you want to say anything more, of course, feel free to do so, but at least you will be conscious that you have passed the 2 minutes. So the next question is...
Excuse me, Paul.
Yes.
Maybe just to make sure that everybody is happy with the time, because this is going to be a bit exhausting. I mean, this is so interesting that I wish we had like 10 hours to go on. But yeah, what we can do, if you agree, yeah, it's try to be as short as possible. And in any case, we won't go beyond 5 o'clock, because I know that some people have something to do at 5 o'clock. Okay.
So 5 o'clock for just those who are not in Brussels is in 1 hour and 10 minutes.
Exactly, in 1 hour and 10 minutes. Very well. Also, now that I speak, I just got a message from Matt, not a video message, but a real message, saying that please accept his apologize, because there was something that he couldn't really foresee, and he had to stay during precisely at this time. He told me, well, you know, when I get committed, I get committed, but this is not something that depends on one most of the time. And also, I will just, a very little final thing, I will put in the chat a link of a web page where you can find all the documents that have been mentioned here, and maybe some others. And if you want us to include there the link to some papers or anything, please do it too. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ignacio. So the fifth question is, which specific policies can help to bridge the intergenerational digital divide? Tracy.
I already promised to give this time to the last question, so pass.
Okay. Amina, are you there, or should we wait for you?
I'm here. Hold on,
okay.
Sorry. Juggling. Sorry, let me just make sure, because I just stepped away and came back. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. It's which specific policies can help to bridge the intergenerational digital divide? So it's question 5.
Yes. So to me, this question is really interesting. It leads to our discussion of digital inclusion supports. You know, I think that beyond just connectivity and devices, training is really important, because there is really interesting research that Common Sense actually is preparing to debut in a few weeks, talking about how there are all sorts of really interesting mental health connections for children. And this actually connects back to their family members, older family members like grandparents and aunts and uncles, and part of the extended family, that allow them to connect more frequently if they have access to the internet. But that's only true, it's only possible if everybody actually is able to utilize these resources and aren't frustrated by utilizing these resources, and that these experiences are positive. And I think one thing, as a mother of a small child, we had all sorts of support from our preschool to do distance learning. It was very difficult to have a 2-year-old, 3-year-old doing any kind of distance program. They're very excited to see their friends, and then they're just like running around the room. So, you know, you really do have to think through, you know, how are you going to engage? And then that's doubly true if you're engaging with a grandparent who may have difficulty managing the technology. And then you've got a small child on the other end who also has difficulty engaging with technology. So training is really key to being able to bridge that.
Oh, thank you, Amina. So, Tom.
Yeah, this isn't really my area of expertise, so I'm going to pass on this one as well.
Okay. Pierre.
Yeah, thank you. I won't be really long, but just to say that some specific programs may help bridge this digital divide between generation, and I'm thinking about really interesting intergenerational programs to educate older adults about digital literacy, where young volunteers mentor an older adult in digital literacy. So you have this mentorship relation, which is really stimulating, and such programs are really interesting from various points of view. They foster cooperation between generations, and they allow for stronger intergenerational links. They also decrease what could be seen as stereotypes about how old ones use technology, and they increase other adults' empowerment and their ability to use digital tools and reduce technophobia, let's say. So these may be part, for instance, of educational or digital policies implemented by governments or local authorities and communities. And I think it's a really interesting point of view to have this mentorship relation and these intergenerational relations. I won't be much longer because I know that we're running out of time.
Thank you, Pierre. Janice?
Yes, one of my experiences in Luxembourg back 20 years ago was that the Luxembourg government set up Internetstuf, internet rooms, fully equipped with a trainer at all times available, and these were in most of the communities. And it's something that worked out very well because no one's asking what you're doing when you go into this room. Well, it's more than a room, I'd say it's sort of a workshop. It seemed to be a very good way, if you look at the figures now in Luxembourg, to get the older generation really involved. But I think there are other ways. We've done successful information sessions in companies, because what we see is that we're disenfranchising the parents. We keep talking about the parents not knowing as much as children, children being digital natives. I think by our very language, we're putting parents down and creating that divide. We need to see older people as a resource. I don't know if you're familiar with the works of Ivan Illich, who suggested that, and this was in the 50s, before we actually had internet, that older people who are specialized in an area could have a learning network where kids of different age came together to learn, for example, I don't know, more about science or to learn about planting a garden. And I think now is the time to start experimenting with these learning networks, stopping dividing kids into age category and giving them a chance to learn things with an older person who doesn't need extraordinary skills, but who can show that they have a lot of knowledge also to share. It's not actually policy, it's more strategy. That's it for me.
Thank you, Denise. Lucy?
I thought only that it depends, the bridge. I think that the most important bridge is to the parents from the children, because this bridge make the difference if the parents could or not, can or not teach the children about the good of the internet and the risks. Many adults today use the digital technology in a primitive, limited and unprotected way. Consequently, they are unable to teach the generation that follows them and how to obtain the best of the internet. It does not seem that it would be a means to match those who receive the internet as adults and those who were born and raised with it. But certainly, education and training for its use should be available for everyone. But also, like Janice said, it depends on, for the oldest one, the interest. Then I think we need to know what is the interest of the second or the third generation that are born without internet.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
Susan?
Thank you. So just a couple points. I completely agree with Janice about sort of media messages about conflict and about differences and things like that, and skewing more around, again, internet as being accessible and positive relationships and things like that. So I think that watch these larger messages. It always comes down to access and equity. And I do believe that if we can get more technology safely in the hands of more people, but again, with the digital skills, is that it's just going to open up the possibilities rather than those age divides and all of those ways that kids are experientially learning more about technology and older adults are not. And which to me means that those professionals that are working across the board, not just teachers, not just the folks that are working with children, but those who are working across the ages, develop the digital skills, the digital competence in terms of the use of technology as a content area for their teaching, so that if a family therapist is working with a family, that they don't forget that technology is an issue and they can, or an aspect that they can promote. I think also then outside of schools, when technology is available, again, this idea that learning is beyond schools, and that idea about connected learning is again, then we start to think of the multiple people in children's lives that help them connect around learning, including older adults. And then when we're thinking about adults' access to technology, again, when we default to thinking about language, many children are in the role of helping parents and grandparents navigate not only technology, but also through language. And so children are kind of doing this double duty of being translators for parents, that we need to, again, make that a little bit more equitable. So yeah, I would just say that a lot of this is going to default back to our earlier points around equity, access, training, and strengthening skills.
Thank you, Susan. Jessica.
Yeah, so when I go back to the question and ask which specific policies can help, I think one of the big answers is we don't really know. We need a lot more research on what the intergenerational digital divide is, right? So not just in terms of access and skills, but also in terms of attitudes. How do people feel about technology? How do they feel about different platforms, right? How do they feel about social media, online gaming? All these types of things come into play. It's not just about how they use it, it's how they feel about it. And that particularly in my research comes into play with parenting. So one of the questions I'm really interested in is, does the parent's generation or their age or their experience with technology impact their attitudes, and then how they parent their child around that? And that we can really target interventions, we can target support based on attitudes, and it's not just about access and outcomes, access and skills. It's really about the attitudes that people carry towards them as well. So I think it's really important that we get more research on that to really understand what some of the motivations are behind resistance or acceptance or fear. So that's really my perspective on that.
Thank you, Jessica.
I believe that the most important digital divide actually relates to a poverty divide and an intergenerational divide. That being said, of course, in poor households, in poor countries where parents are illiterate, as I was saying before, there is also this intergenerational divide. It's, as I said before, difficult to support your child learning when you are not able to read yourself. And also another thing we found in using, again, mixed data, and we have done some research brief about it, is that in the poorest households, you usually don't even have any learning material, textbooks like child-oriented textbooks at household level. It's really marginal, and it can make a difference. I mean, when you look at the same type of household, meaning poorest household, and you look those that have child material, like learning material at home, compared to those that don't, there is a significant difference. I remember data from Pakistan, Punjab state, or from African countries that showing that like very significantly. The same with the parental support. When you have an adult in the household that is able to support his kids to do his homework or to read, etc., of course, it makes a big difference. And of course, again, in the poorest, less educated parents' household, it's more difficult.
Oh, by the way, I wanted to suggest that if you feel you don't have enough time to make your whole contribution because of the time problem in the 2 minutes, maybe I want to suggest maybe if we could have the email of Remy or through Ignacio, that you can write down the rest of your contribution so that Remy can also use it for his own contribution. So Ignacio, I don't know if you Remy, yes, okay, perfect. Wonderful. Okay, so I just wanted to say that because it would be a pity if some of your expertise would not be considered for this focus group. Okay, so the next question is, it's a very specific one. Should coding be introduced as a classroom subject like other languages? So Tracy.
So there's two parts to this question. Should coding be introduced as a classroom subject? I would say sure, it already is in many cases. It's starting even as young as primary school in some systems. It's an interesting skill, it's a useful skill, and it is, expected to continue to be relevant and useful. But programming languages are not a natural language. And I think it's important to keep that distinction. So they cannot be used, for example, to replace a foreign language credit or something like that. I mean, language is about cultural nuance. It's about interpersonal relationships. It's about humor. And that's exactly what stumps AI when we think about language processing. They're extremely good at basic text. It's all the nuance that makes it hard for them. And that's a uniquely human element. And I think we can't lose that distinction. So yes to coding, but I do not agree that it is definitely not a natural language.
Thank you, Tracy. Amina.
So I'll be very brief here. Our interest in coding is very focused on sort of the underlying technology and supports. One issue with coding is that you need to make sure you have appropriate access to technology and devices. We've worked really closely with the Kapoor Center in the United States, who has been expanding access to coding for students that are traditionally underrepresented. And so I think this is really important, but it comes with the caveat of making sure that these communities have access to the robust infrastructure and devices that are required to be able to succeed in this space.
Thank you. Tom.
Yes, my answer is yes, and as it's already been said, coding goes on in a lot of countries, but obviously not universally. A lot of countries. I've got a couple of points to make. The first one is, but how? I have to say, having sat in on my homeschooling lesson with my daughter on computer science, it was incredibly dull and functional, and that's no reflection on the teacher. It's very difficult to teach this stuff online, but there is a big question on how, and so many of the digital tech has been created by people who've done this in their own time through experimenting, through learning, and not through actually lessons in classes. So how possible is it actually to teach what we want in a classroom in that setting? But I'd be more interested actually in the content of that course. And actually, I think we only should learn coding if it actually serves to make us more human and contribute to society. And therefore, we need coding and ethics going alongside each other. A book that I'm inspired by, Rania Fuha's book, saying let's don't be evil. She talks to us about how did the big tech industry lose its soul. That's what she says, lose its soul. And she talks about how much of the tech entrepreneurs to start with were altruistic, they were idealistic. Tim Berners-Lee and others have really talked about their hope that this would bring great things to humanity, but it hasn't turned out in many ways like that. And that's because quite often the focus has been on market value over more society values. There's a focus on value over values in many ways. So therefore, I think we need coding, but we need coding alongside kind of digital citizenship, character, social, emotional, and these other areas working alongside each other. And in those in combination maybe mean that technology is really impinged on going on some of the biggest challenges that we face as a world right now.
Thank you, Tom. Pierre.
Thanks. New technologies are transforming the skills students need to enter the labor market and shape their future. And that's why indeed many schools have begun teaching coding. So to me, the introduction of coding is really relevant as students digital skills need to evolve with technological developments. However, I think we should bear in mind that technological change is accelerating at rather unprecedented speed, and that coding skills tend to become quite obsolete in only a few years' time. This means that what you learn today may be obsolete by the time you graduate. And from that, I think what's really interesting is not the programmation language in themselves. We should rather focus on the way we enable students to learn how to learn. That means being able to acquire new skills continually. And of course, it requires some flexibility, of course, and a rather positive attitude towards lifelong learning. And we should also enable students to get the logic behind coding so as to foster computational thinking. So I think pupils should understand coding rather than know coding. And you can teach coding as rather an isolated technique, and that does not seem really relevant to me. Or you can teach coding as a way to understand algorithmic thinking, which is much more relevant, I think. So it may be of great use for students when it comes to solving problems and addressing unknown issues in their life.
Thank you, Pierre. Denise.
Yes, if schools want to teach coding, that's fine. It shouldn't be obligatory. It's a specialist subject, and it should be for young people who are really interested in it. It does teach logic, but I think there are other ways to do it. And young people who learn coding, how much can they use it? As Pierre said, it becomes quite rapidly obsolete. I would rather see that schools teach children about cyber resilience, meaning that they can find new solutions for problems, they can contour problems, they can create also, learning about algorithms, about big data, about profiling. There are many elements that they need to learn, and therefore I would rather see that first, and coding really just for those who are very interested in learning it.
Thank you, Denise. Luci.
Janice, I like so much your opinion. Like a psychoanalyst, I can say that the human language is a way for human communication, but with inflections, intonations, and that have together a sensory experience. Our language, we begins to learn at the pregnancy. So we hear and we will work with the words, with the sense of the words. And when we can play with the words, we are inside the language. The human brain doesn't work with mathematics operation. It's different by the codes that use and computer program that is repetitive, which conditional structures, loop structure, image operation. This is only to send a message that is yes or no, that don't have the intermediary, and the principles of our language is to can discuss, to can have the doubt, to have the psychosis, the psychotic person don't have doubt, like a computer. So the codes doesn't feel the requirement for a language. It's good to learn, but in the time, there are many things to go to internet, safe internet to learn before, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Luci. Susan.
Thank you. Also, in the sake of time, I'll capsulize what I'm saying to say what Pierre said. From what I understand about teaching coding, It too is, we have to be careful because it could quickly become obsolete in terms of a specific language. Python may not be the computer language that is used. So it is far more of value to teach computational thinking, and exactly as Pierre was saying. The other aspect is then, however it is going to be taught, I would also agree with Tracy that it is not like other languages when we think about what human language actually is, but to really compartmentalize that programming language is its own skill for a specific AI purpose. And then finally, however it is going to be taught, we do need to think about equity, and we need to think about who we are promoting computational thinking to, and to widen it out to a broader range of audiences, particularly to women, and to, as Amina was saying, less promoted audiences, and that message go beyond to the individual, but is more of a societal message. Because when it's embraced as being skills and of value to all of society, there'll be a wider embracement of what that means for the workplace, for women to be able to work, so that the message just needs to be broader. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Jessica.
I just have a quick thing to add to what everybody else has said, is that, you know, obviously coding can become obsolete, but I do think that, oh gosh, oh, I am on. Okay, sorry. I thought maybe I was muted. That I really think that teaching children ways that they can create content is incredibly important, so that we know that teens, for example, who are active creators of content have better mental health outcomes than those who are passive. So if we're giving children and teens skills that they can use to create digital illustrations, for example, digital photography, video skills, website development, all these different types of ways that they can create, and they can participate in online communities as opposed to being passive and just observing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, I think it's an interesting question, but why not, again, with a perspective of the poorest? Sorry to be focused on that, but that's my life, and that's why I do the job I do. Why not? Of course, I mean, why? But sometimes there are also trade-off, and budgetary trade-off, and resources trade-off in terms of human resources. So I think that even more crucial than teaching coding, if I take the lens of low-income and middle-income countries, I think the foundational skills are even more important. I mean, of course, if they can do also coding, if they can code, even better. But you heard the number I was reminding you about, the state of the learning crisis. I mean, when you have half of the kids in the world that cannot read a simple text, yes, it's good if they could code, but to be able to code anyway, they need to be able to read, correct? So that would be I think the first priority, in particular in so many countries where there is a budget constraint context.
To integrate question 7 and 8, because they are quite related content. So if you need a little bit more of 2 minutes because you prepared the 2 questions, take a little bit more. But it can also help us a little bit to fasten a little bit the meeting. So I will read them. Question 7 is, what instruments should be developed to ban child abuse materials online? And 8 is, what is the best tool parents can use to prevent online abuse of their children? So both are focused on how can we combat, how can we prevent online abuse of the children? So Tracy.
Thanks. And just to say that I will have to apologize because I'll have to leave around 10 minutes before 5. So if we're not done, just a thanks to everyone for such a fascinating discussion. To answer the question, I think, I mean, there's many elements of this, and I'll just focus a little bit on some of the work we've been doing, which is thinking about sort of the positioning of what the various risks are, one of which is child abuse online. And the OECD, for example, is currently developing or updating guidelines for children in the digital environment. It's an update of their protection of children online work that came out in 2012, which was very much focused on protection and sort of the sort of threats to children online. These recommendations take a broader perspective, which also look at sort of the empowering element of the online world without forgetting, of course, the risks. So turning to the risks, I mean, one of the big thing and one of the positioning of the OECD and also something like UNICEF, which has, of course, even broader coverage, country coverage, is the obvious, which is many of our systems are based on national education is a national system, regulatory systems and judicial systems can be national or regional. So if you want to sort of protect children and prosecute children or sort of abusers, your enforcement tools are often limited in geography. Whereas we know, of course, that the internet has no borders and has no boundaries, and geography is actually in many ways irrelevant. And so one of the main challenges is not just identifying and tracking and protecting and intervening, but how do you actually legislate and enforce the guidelines and enforce national laws in an international arena, and particularly for somebody who lives in another country, for example. So I think one of the main things there is really understanding the sort of the landscape, which is very fragmented, even within countries. It covers multiple different ministries, all of which often have their own policies and their own rules and their own guidelines. And then it covers multiple countries. And so one of the big challenges is not just what are the tools, but how do you enforce them? And how do you actually track down and penalize someone who is, of course, breaking the law? To just briefly talk about the parenting thing, because I'm aware I've already taken a bit of time, to just sort of think through not just tools, but attitudes. So this is something that was already brought up. Jessica, you brought this up, but sort of this, there's been historically, at least, or in the last 10 years, a real push to protect children from all risk, which often sort of creates a situation where you minimize risk or you remove risk to the extent possible. Parents, of course, are doing that with the best interests of their children at heart. But what's clear is that children need to not only be aware of what risks are, but they need to be able to manage them. They need to know what to do if they're exposed. They need a language to tell their parents that they've experienced this. So it's about managing risks and allowing parents to talk to their children so that they have the tools to react and let people know that this is happening to them if they're exposed. So really just a plea to sort of move away from the language of minimizing risk and more towards managing and awareness and resilience.
Thank you. I want to give the word now to Jessica because she has to leave in 5 minutes. So Jessica.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry. I have a meeting at 10:30 my time. I'll just kind of jump off what Tracy was saying and take a much more narrow view. I'm not really sure about how to ban the child abuse materials online. That's not my area of research. But when it comes to the best tool that parents can use, I think it's really simple. It's not magic. It's talking. It's having a positive relationship with your child. It's being open. It's so that when, for example, somebody who claims to be Tico is playing with them on Fortnite, is saying, I'm not going to play with you if you don't have your mic on. Having them come to you and say, this feels weird to me. This doesn't feel quite right. Rather than them experiencing that and then you saying, that's it, you can't play Fortnite anymore. So there's going to be there needs to be this discussion. There has to be this openness and this sort of acknowledgement that these things might happen, and the best way to solve them is through discussion and through examining the risks from all sides and seeing what we can change in the future. And so, we don't know a lot about parental digital mediation. We don't know what specific skills and strategies are the absolute best when it comes to digital technologies. We don't know that yet. We don't have the research, but we do know about parenting in general. And so I think right now we can go off of that and say the best thing we can do is be active. We can download those apps ourselves, download Instagram, download TikTok, see what's going on, get an understanding of that. And that's the best way to prevent children from, child abuse online. And even bullying online is to be able to be engaged and understand the technology that they're using and have an open relationship where they can come talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, for this question, also for your contribution in general. Thank you very much. And you have seen in the chat that Remy has shared his email. So if there was, for example, another topic, question mine that you wanted to address, feel free to write them an email, okay? So now I want to go to Amina.
Thanks all. So on the topic of CSAM, I think there is significant questions of how do you support enforcement? Obviously the laws are going to be different from country to country. There's significant discussion underway in the United States around the impact of a law that offers a shield to internet service, to social media companies and other platforms, Section 230, and whether or not that shield prevents appropriate enforcement against CSAM. Certainly there are discussions like that where you can change laws. I think it's valuable for policymakers and for advocates to think flexibly about what existing laws can and cannot do, considering the changing landscape of technology and what technology does in terms of the harms landscape for children and for families, and how children and families can navigate that landscape. I think there's too much pressure put on families and children to be responsible to push back on these types of threats, and there needs to be a lot more onus placed on the platforms themselves to bake in these types of protections from the get-go. That's significantly different than just beefing up enforcement, which, you can have great laws, but then you also have to pay to make sure that you've got the enforcers in place. And then, all of that has to play out. In the meantime, families have experienced harm that, really should have been preventable in the first place, or, to the extent it was preventable, was prevented, right? And so also focusing on ways that we can dig in to sort of lifting up the hood and understanding the algorithms that promote this interaction between kids and potential threats, figuring out different ways that we can actually harness technology to help prevent this or to help flag these types of harms in advance, I think is really important. And that's something that policymakers can do in coordination with industry to better present, what are these sort of safety and security measures that they can guarantee that doesn't require, again, that doesn't place the onus on the parents of the kids, but rather is on the providers themselves. And so, and then beefing up, instead of just enforcement, traditional consumer protection measures that allow kids and families to feel some confidence that if providers aren't doing what they say in terms of providing a safe environment, that they actually have some recourse before harm is experienced, that they can say, you're promising these types of safeguards. These safeguards don't exist. You don't have to experience harm to say that those types of consumer protections have failed. So just finding different ways to be proactive and preventative, not just beefing up enforcement.
Thank you, Amina. Tom.
Yeah, thank you very much. As I said earlier, the internet and other digital technologies presents a huge amount of problems for us when we try to regulate these things for lots of the reasons we've been said. They're global, they cross borders, they have certain affordances within these technologies that makes it very hard to track people through kind of anonymity and those sorts of issues. This doesn't mean that governments and policymakers and the tech companies themselves have not got a great deal of responsibility in this area, but until they catch up, then I have to go along with Jessica's and kind of others' answers that says right now the best tool, the best people, the best equipment we've got to really deal with really problematic challenges connected with child safety online is ourselves, is parents, teachers and educators. I focus a lot of my work on how schools, parents and others can cultivate what I call a quality of cyber wisdom. That's wisdom to learn and not always get it right, but learn what is the right thing to do at the right time. And in particular, and this is very pertinent to the internet when no one is actually looking, is that quality of kind of knowing how to make a wise decision. That's developed through what Tracy was saying earlier, and I agree with around kind of experiential learning. We need to let our children learn, play, and live in the world and learn from there. But we need to be there as people who's advisors and supporters and to help. Now, that is a fear to many parents because we don't think we know the technology very well, but the issues are very similar. We've always protected our children. That's been our role of having to protect our children. So we understand the issues if we don't always understand the technology. But what is lacking is, I think, a very good education around this, not only just for parents and teachers themselves, who often feel that they're behind the curve on understanding this, but also the education for children happening in schools, often broadly called kind of digital citizenship education in these sorts of areas. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. Quite often this happens to be reactionary. We tend to be just trying to catch up or follow something that's happened, often drop in, you know, Safer Internet Day is absolutely fantastic, but that is a day. This stuff is happening day in, day out. It can't just be dropped in. It's not always joined up. Children really get many opportunities from the internet as well as risks. How do these things combine together, the risks and opportunities? Quite often it can be overly kind of morally problematic or panicky around the risks without also recognizing the opportunities around that. It's deficit-based, as I've said, focused too often on problems, and also quite deterministic, you know, because the technology exists, this is going to happen. We've got to avoid deterministic accounts of technology. It's essentially the technology is neutral, I think was said earlier. It's how we use that technologies that actually is matters in terms of its outcomes. So overly deterministic accounts and often fearful accounts don't always help in this sort of area. Of course, we've got to recognize the risk, but we've also got to understand that we can help our children make better and wiser decisions in that place. There isn't a great deal of support and joined up framework around there, and I think helping to make the curriculum more future-proof in that sort of area is somewhere that we really need to put some particular focus on.
Thank you very much, Tom. Pierre.
Yes, thank you very much. When it comes to law enforcement, we obviously need more training and resources to take down child abuse online, and I have to say it's quite easy to say. When it comes to banning child abuse materials online, I guess software can be developed to do a major part of this work for authorities, and it could be put on the same level as some techniques we have against, for instance, terrorism online. Then what is the best tool? The question was, what is the best tool parents can use to prevent online abuse of their children? I found it really interesting when Jessica spoke about communication, and I have the same opinion. I think the best tool could be speaking skills and interpersonal communication between parents and kids. That means speaking openly and choosing the right words and not eluding real risks, and not keeping some subjects taboo, which could cause fascination or unwanted risk-taking behaviors. There are also really interesting apps that can be used to track children activities. However, maybe here again, I think it's best to avoid secrets and taboo and to just speak openly with children and to tell them this app is on their device and what it does and what it doesn't do. And here again, I think discussion is key.
Thank you, Pierre. Denise.
Yes, this is a topic of special interest to me today because just today I succeeded in getting a hotline in Morocco. The IWF hotline, I think you all know, is where you can signal child sexual abuse material you find online. My 3 years trying to achieve this has shown me that child sexual abuse is also cultural. And you have to be so careful when you are, and the question was, what instrument should be developed to ban? But when you ban material like this in a country like Morocco and similar countries, the child, even though it may not be as bad as that, may get into great trouble. It can go, as we know, as far as murder. So you have to take into account the cultural approach in that country. I think the hotlines really do a great job. However, and they crawl the web. We have something called photo DNA, where an image of a child, when once it's been pixelized, can be recognized anywhere else. And in this way, Facebook and the other social media take down about 90% of this content before anyone actually sees it. So it's put online and it's taken down. In Europe, we have the European Electronic Communication Code that was just passed, which bans the usage of such crawlers. So I think we're going to be finding a whole lot more child sexual abuse material online. And as far as families are concerned, at the Council of Europe, I wrote a manual called the Digital Citizenship Education Handbook. There we say that in fact there are 4 areas of skills. There are values, attitudes, skills, and knowledge and understanding. But you have to start with the values and attitudes. You have to build trust with children so that they have their values, they know what they can do and what they can't do before they reach the age of 5, 6, or 7, when they take their first independent steps online. So trust, building these values, these attitudes, informing parents, which is not always easy. In some countries I work with, 30% of the parents are illiterate. Very transparent legislation so that parents know what to do and where to go when they see this sort of trouble, because for many people, legislation is actually out of their reach and they have no idea of their rights. They don't know who to turn to. I think also parents have to learn that as soon as their child goes on social media, they should go from time to time and check the child footprints with that child. And you can very rapidly see the sort of personal information a child is putting out by checking the footprint. There are people hiding behind a very innocent face on internet, but they can't reach out and grab a child. If a child really understands privacy, if they keep their private details, if they don't accept contact from unknown people online, then they can't get into this trouble. And once again, cyber resilience. I think that this is the role of everyone from the very earliest age to help children build their cyber resilience. We understand resilience much more now, and so there is a lot more that we can do. One last initiative I should speak about, Europol has brought together all of the credit card companies, Visa, MasterCard, etc. And together, they not only ensure that payments aren't made for sexual exploitation, but they also work with banks to make sure that bank transfers can't be made. So we have to cut out the industry it exists, but we must never forget that 70% of the images, the child sexual abuse images that went online in 2019 were auto-generated by young people. So when we think of that figure, I think there are many things we can do. Sorry, I may have been too long on that. As creator of Safer Internet Day, I feel very strongly about these things.
Thank you very much. Luci.
So this is my work now, and when I think about instruments to ban, is it possible? We need to consider that the facilities to the artificial intelligence to find children and adolescents on internet, the identification of the unprotected and neglected children. Yeah, I think that more than ban child abuse material, we need to talk about ban the violence, the sexual violence, because one support the other. But we have also another, I will see this time, we have also another violence, physical violence, psycho violence and neglect that comes to the children and adolescents. We have at the internet the the mortal, the death challenge to put the plastic on the head, to the enforcement, to the asphyxia, to suffocation. There are many violence on the internet that is stimulated by the ways, normal ways, the dangerous selfies, and we have more and more, each more adolescents that comes to that. So I think when we talk about violence and not sexual, we have mortal challenges. We have the psychic violence, and we have also children and adolescents that make cutting and risk, put in risk your lives. Perhaps you can talk about violence, physical, psychical, sexual violence. And I think we need to learn. The Brazilian society has a lot of recommendations for the pregnant, for the mother, the fathers in the first day. Is very interesting, and we think that it could work, but for criminal minds, for the people that have perversion, the child is every time fragile. I see the sequence of the pedophiles or the other abuser, sexual abuser, is very difficult that the children or the adolescents could resist. So I think that we need more than the material. We need to ban, and we need to work with the companies that accept this material, that store and distribute. So we don't have not only the criminal minds, we have also the companies that permit the violence. So I think we need rules, we need law. The interesting will be if the law could be international law, a basic international law. But we have already...
Luci, you're on 4 minutes.
Okay, so my opinion is to the law, okay? The importance of the law. Thank you.
Thank you, Luci. Susan.
Thank you. I'm actually really happy that the two questions are put together, because the practical aspects of limiting children's exposure and the family dynamic of limiting children's exposure really have to go hand in hand. I think any parent would say that with all of the things that parents have to consider, oftentimes, we would look to technology, or we would look to schools, or we would look outside and go, why aren't they doing more to protect our kids? So these are really not issues that can be looked at separately, I think. From a practical standpoint, I'm just going to echo what others have said in terms of, I think that we do need to step up and have more protections for children. Not to track children, not profiling them, limiting their access and whatnot, but also from an industry standpoint, that there is a wider acceptance of that the technology industry is not just about making money, and to really step up the ethics around who's being affected and that sort of thing. From the family dynamic, however, and this is, my area, I would just remind that I absolutely agree, and when the question was about what tool do parents best have, it is good parenting. And I think we need to first strip away technology and just look at the dynamic of what good parenting is, and relationships with children and that sort of thing. However, I think we also need to remember that families are very messy, and that technology for families is just one of many, many things that parents are parenting about and that families are communicating about. And while we would like many families to step up and do more related to digital citizenship and things like that, for most families, they're simply overwhelmed. There's been quite a backlash about the parent responsibilities with COVID and limiting their children's screen time and things like that. And so, I think a kinder, gentler approach to supporting families around digital media is needed, where we also understand the wide variety of families, families who are homeless, right? Families who they're working 3 jobs and are lucky if they can kiss their kids goodnight rather than spend a lot of time on their technology education. And also cultural differences in parenting, because the families that I know that feel the most secure around technology with their children are the families that are embedding technology within their system of family rules as it is, in terms of, when we use technology or if we turn devices off during dinner time or where technology goes, it's just part of the way that that family happens to operate. And it could be the same thing about going to church every week or getting kids to school on time or whatever. And so technology is a separate issue, but it's also an integrated issue. And then finally, I'm going to put in a plug for parenting education. Parenting education is not a strategy that is oftentimes adopted when we're looking at that investment of family supports. We look at education and housing and employment, but those are things that families have to do to survive and to thrive. But the job of parenting is really, really hard, and it's becoming even more complex. And so I would just really advocate, when we are looking at how children are using technology and the parent mediation and how parents look at their own use of technology, which factors a great deal to how well children are going to listen to them about technology, is that we just give more benefit to parenting education and parenting support as a necessary value. And if we're doing that, and this is going to get to my answer to the next question, which is on additional things to consider, is again looking at the helpers, looking at the people who work directly with families and what their digital knowledge is and what their digital skills are, and their own digital competence.
Thank you, Susan.
On this one, I'm not a specialist on that, but I'm happy to direct you to other researchers in our UNICEF Office of Research and related publications that are actually available on our website. We have, for example, this very nice project called Global Kids Online that looks at both low-income, middle-income, and high-income countries, where there is more recommendation regarding the type of things to pay attention to in terms of child abuse. Of course, there are all the things related to pornography. There are all the conversation about fake news. There are a lot of things related to key instruments and policies that could be potentially put in place to mitigate this risk, which is a real risk. On the positive side, maybe it's, even if it's not your question, what we see more and more on digital learning is that it's not the tool that counts, it's more the fact that it would be embedded in order to get learning outcomes and to get child growth and development of brain, etc. is more like being embedded within a right pedagogical approach and being playful, like when kids enjoy learning because it's game kind, like they learn more. But it's not your question, so maybe I will not unpack that. I don't know if it is more a question of tools, even if of course parental control security option on internet could help and maybe valid. I believe it's more a question of communication with your children. I mean, and I'm saying that without having any kids, so I'm not even having a personal experience on that. But I'm a big believer that what counts is what do you communicate to your kids of what is good, what is not good, how to pay attention to potential, in particular girls, of course, because the risks are, I think, higher for young girls to be in difficult contexts and difficult situations in regard to, in relation to abuse. And again, in low-income countries, if I take again I put again my equity hat. In low-income countries, when parents are not even literate, it's an additional challenge, you know. But as I said, I'm not a specialist on those things. I'm happy to direct you to papers about that from our office. We have a very good team on digital space, including particularly on those issues of safety for kids.
Would you like to mention any other topic? That if you have another topic, feel free to send it in an email to Remy. And so I want to conclude now this part. Thank you a lot for all the contributions. I think it was very inspiring. And also, what I found inspiring is that the different answers, they really enriched each other. So it was not like a repetition of answers. It was really something that I can imagine that Remy can make a wonderful report of all of your contributions. Before finishing, I want to ask Renata Kakmarska, who has been with us. She is the United Nations focal point of the family, and she's also present in this meeting. And maybe she wants to say some words before we finish.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for giving me the floor. I would like to thank, first of all, IFFD for convening this focal group. I listened with attention to all your views, and I really appreciate your diverse opinions and perspective that you offered. This is really helping my work. Just to say that when we approach the issue of new technologies, digital technologies, of course, this is a topic of the Commission for Social Development, which is a commission that my division is serving. But I would focus, I always have to keep in mind that within the UN, you know, there's a global kind of global perspective on digital technologies. For example, there is a quite new report, UN report on UN's called UN's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation that was issued June 2020, and there are many aspects of technology already covered in that report. However, our mission, you know, as a focal point on the family is that to showcase the family perspective on technologies. So that's why our main focus is three issues: family well-being in general, work-family balance, and parenting education, and how technologies can help in these three aspects. So this is the family perspective. However, just to mention that I'm also drafting a report on the social integration through social inclusion, and that's a report that tackles different aspects of social inclusion. And we had a resolution, the latest resolution on this topic had a paragraph specifically referring to ICTs as solutions to developmental challenges, and in general bridging the digital divide, also as a measure to attain social integration, and especially integration of social groups, which is youth, older persons, persons with disabilities, and indigenous peoples. So I need to be focused on this issue, just to say that this discussion really helped me kind of gain a better perspective on the issues that we have on our agenda. And we are currently working with Susan. Susan Walker is our consultant for a major project, a background paper on the use of technologies and focusing specifically on work-family balance in parenting education. So this publication will be launched at the International Day of the Families, which will be held, which is 15 May, but will probably be held on the 14th of May this year. And I invite everyone to contribute to setting up a website where we can share all this knowledge. So the knowledge that was produced at today's meeting, all the reports that you mentioned, we would like to leave a trace and give stakeholders, being member states, civil society organizations, academics, giving them a way to contribute and giving them a tool as a resource tool to advance their research, and also encourage more focus on families where we talk about technologies. So that's so thank you so much for this very rich discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then we can conclude this focus group meeting. So thank you again to all. Ignacio, I don't know if you want to say anything else or we just can finish.
Just this, thank you very much for all your contributions. This was really a very, very interesting meeting.
Okay, bye-bye everybody.